I greet you all. I say hello. For those watching live, welcome. Whether you're here on the West Coast, good morning. Maybe late morning if you're Mountain Time, Central Time. Many of you perhaps on the East Coast, a lunch hour maybe. Welcome. I hope this finds everyone well. I'm writing down some do not forget things, right? Those are important. And then what happens from occasion to occasion is that you don't remember them. And then you look down at the end and you think, oh, bummer, forgot that. So what I'll do is I'll be upfront about it. There's a post-event survey that's going to come your way. Take that survey. It doesn't take much time. It's a couple of clickety clacks away. And I'll hopefully remember to say that at the end as well, but I've got the post-it note right there. Well, let's begin. Today, a big topic, a weighty topic, but a topic we are all intimately familiar with given our practice. And whether you find yourself in day-to-day practice, supervising practitioners, supervising supervisors, maybe you're a clinical director, maybe you're in an academic setting, maybe you're a student, doesn't matter. This topic, it pervades our discipline. And the title is a little, it's not tongue in cheek, but there's some words in there intended to not provoke necessarily, but to perhaps heighten our attention. This sort of, whether we think about it from a contemporary approach, contemporary deliberately put in there, or maybe we use the word maladaptive. We'll talk about the different phrasing that I'm acquainted with. I'm your host, your faithful host. This is the fourth in our installment of clinical series for our Essentials users. And whether you're an Essentials user or another one of the users of Essential Reach's products, welcome. From an agenda point of view, what are we looking to do? These map on with the learning objectives that I get to do a number of different things, work with a really great as required to colleagues, that ethics and designation for our CEU to continue to be able to. But we're going to. I think it's pertinent and prudent of us to take a look at our historical approaches to addressing behaviors of concern. And while also considering how those historical approaches relate to what we are doing contemporarily, again, that's a real opportunity inside that Q&A to participate, to lend your own voice in this. Listen, you guys are, for the most part, just given historical attendees, you're practicing every day, day in, day out. You guys are the ones who are, obviously doing the hard work of supporting those that we serve. And so share that voice. Lending your voice to these conversations really enriches the scope of what we get to talk about. And like I said, always reach out sort of on the back end too, if you want to just have a conversation with me. So we're going to look at those approaches. I think these aren't just kind of buzzwords and cool terms. There's real scholarship going on right now with regard to ableism. And let's be honest, I mean, the scholarship around ableism, whether we are new to it in behavior analysis, I mean, that is many decades old in terms of real scholarship behind that. And this notion of assent-based practice, look, if you go to a conference, you're likely to see a panel perhaps about this. And I'll have some comments about my own reactions to those types of things. But I think those are really vital things for us to be talking about, and perhaps fit neatly within this conversation around behaviors of concern. And then interweaved within all of it, not sort of sequentially, but really interweaved with all of it, we're going to look at kind of the ethical practice implications. And much of this is kind of done even before we're working with a learner. Most of this is done in the way that we create a context in our organization, the way that we ongoingly support our development of our staff. If you're curious about staff development, we did that last month, and had I really enjoyed that content. I am biased though, so keep that in mind. Of course, I'm going to enjoy that content. So it has a lot to do with the context and sort of setting that we promote within our organization. It has a lot to do with the ongoing development support that we provide our staff. It has a lot to do with the way that we word and phrase and write our treatment plans, our reauthorization plans, our communication to stakeholders, whether they be parents, educators, whoever. And so, this ethical implication is really weaved within all of this content. Um, all right, enough with that. No questions thus far. Good. Haven't said anything really, so that's great. I think it's also important for me to say that this is not an opportunity for me to, or what I'm not intending to do is reteach a graduate level intervention or assessment course. It's not going to, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. Not in this amount of time, and despite maybe having having a sense of arrogance, I wouldn't dare think that I could deliver on that sort of thing. So that's not what this is. This is not intended to be like, a coursework in that area. And furthermore, if you're certified, you've taken those courses. But I'll tell you something a little bit about that is that, it's that coursework that we do, that sort of dedicated time that is helpful to revisit. And in preparation of this webinar, I revisited several of those courses of mine, and maybe later we can comically laugh at how long ago that was. But it was refreshing rereading not only some of that content, but some of those really hallmark articles that, frankly, I had forgotten about. I had not forgotten necessarily the impact it has had on me professionally in my thinking and the way I approach things, but it was nice to read those primary texts again. It was nice to read those articles again, some of which are now many decades old. And they read as fresh today as they did in the 70s or in the 60s or in the 80s or 90s or whatever. And so that was, although this is not a time to reteach that class, it is a time perhaps to encourage a revisitation of some of those things. And if you're the kind of dork that I am, revisiting those things, there's some comfort in that at times, and there's also some challenges in that at sometimes. And I maybe if I think about it and I read my notes adequately, I will share some stories of my own revisitation of some of those themes. Well, the behavior analyst, it's no longer its perspective on behavior analysis now, but it used to be called the behavior analyst. And before that, it was something different. No, it's perspectives on behavior science. Sorry, that's the journal. They used to have an on-terms section. I used to read those all the time. I really liked that. Love it when we look at, one of my favorite sidebar. One of my favorite articles is this was written in the 90s from one of the finest we have in behavior analysis. Dinsmore wrote a 2-part series on stimulus control. It's still one of the best things I've ever read. Try to read it once a year. Part 1 and part 2. It's fabulous, and it really does just kind of dive very deeply in not just the term stimulus control, but in any time someone of really high caliber scholarship goes in and invests the kind of scrutiny necessary to look at a term, I'm very keen on what they arrive at. Maybe not in search of agreement necessarily, but certainly in search of an opportunity to really think critically about a term that maybe we use all the time, or a phrase that we find ourselves using that maybe we're not terribly comfortable with. And I have 2 little anecdotes when we talk about, what frankly a lot of people call problem behavior, right? And just because I don't call it problem behavior anymore doesn't mean I didn't call it problem behavior back then. When we talk about the words that we use and how they matter, 2 anecdotes come to mind. One is early in my practice, before certification, and really I'm at the RBT level well before there was an RBT designation to be had. It was in that instance, I was a tutor. I had a case manager, a doctoral graduate student at the time, who remains a dear friend and colleague, Janice Stoney. We were working with a very, very challenging young individual, challenging just because of the topography of many of the behaviors that they exhibited in a therapeutic environment. And there was some research that had been conducted by a precision teacher, Abigail Culkin, that had demonstrated quite convincingly that by just doing 1 minute timings of positive thoughts pre and post session really transformed not only the experience of a session, regardless of behaviors observed, but also transformed adherence to protocols and also creative thinking and creative thinking in this way led to creative practice that can be so vital in making adjustments to treatment plans and protocols to make sure that those we serve, frankly, are being served. And so, that was a really that was a pretty profound experience that has stayed with me for decades. Just an economical intervention on the therapist in this case. And I don't say therapist in a clinical context necessarily like a clinical psychologist, but in terms of those providing the care. Simply just sitting down, writing for 1 minute pre and post session, positive thoughts. It's pretty cool. The another one too is worked. This is further along in my career. Worked along with some really fabulous colleagues, and we were examining some of the ways we talked about one of our learners. And one of the individuals that worked really regularly with this learner, who again, had a lot of challenging topographies. Challenging from the context of what you want to get accomplished within a session, and we'll talk a little bit about that kind of difference in perspective as we move along. But they really hit the nail on the head when they freely disclosed that they would even sort of jokingly refer to the learner as a monster, little monster, just a little monster, and not necessarily in an aggressive or demeaning way, but nonetheless pejoratively. And just the way that context was established because of the word they used to refer to the individual. Language is referential. Skinner said that, and everyone after that. And we can get into a conversation about perhaps some of the difficulty that referential behavior may pose from a conceptual level, but that's far beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But without getting too far off into the weeds, words refer to things and events. And when we think of someone as a little monster, let's say, that changes the way that you think about the person. It has a profound effect, whether you measure it or not. And that's a different story from an ethical perspective. Some things, some things that matter don't get measured. It doesn't mean that they don't matter. But the way that we think about a learner, the words we use to describe them, even not to them, to their face, but even jokingly behind the scenes, just to kind of bring some lightness. I'm not saying we're making fun of somebody, but we do this whether we're talking in a professional context or a personal context. We will refer to things in ways that bring lightness, because when things are heavy, and I'm speaking, colloquially here, not even using middle-level terms, but I'm using terms that I think we can all relate to in some way. When we try to bring lightness or levity to something that is heavy, hard, or difficult, it's not to demean necessarily, although some people take it too far. It's a way to bring some distance to the difficulty that we're experiencing. And I think there's something to be said about that as a practice, and also finding ways that we can productively do that by really being astute to the words that we use. And not calling people out for don't say that, like from a rule standpoint, but really functionally looking at how do the words we use within our organization affect the way that we work with people. It's not going to change the fact that we have people we work with and for that we like more than others. That's a part of being a human being. But despite liking someone more, that's not really within our professional purview. That's just a part of life, and we have to compartmentalize that. And that's not, again, I know who I'm speaking with here. These are practicing colleagues that I know I'm not saying anything new, but hopefully maybe we're developing the foundation of a conversation that might lead to some insights later on. Many of those insights are going to come from you, not from me, but hopefully from reactions to the content we talk about today. So as we kind of explore these terms, what we say matters. I don't think that this isn't new necessarily. It's not mine, and whoever you heard it from first, it wasn't theirs either. This has been there for a long time. But these are just common phrases that we use as a way to refer to behaviors that impede the learning or the teaching we want to do. And there are things that we can think about that. Problem behavior. And, the question becomes, well, who's it a problem for? And more often than not, it's a problem for you. It's a problem for the parent. It's a problem for the teacher. It's a problem for the care worker. And then you may say, yeah, but it is actually a problem for them. And then you think, well, okay, what does that mean? What do you mean it's a problem for them? How do you know it's a problem for them? Did they tell you? Did they come to you and say, I don't want to do this anymore? Is that the only way that that could be communicated? Again, I'm not here to provide those answers, but hopefully you can hear an answer behind the way that I'm phrasing it to know that we work with a very diverse kind of people, right? And diversity in the sense that they exhibit all the kind of scope of human concern that humans do anyway. But sometimes it's done in such a way, in such a magnitude, in such a degree that it looks not like the others, let's say. And so we put these phrases on there because we have to put a title to something in our treatment plans, in our communication to staff, in our communication to parents. We have to say something, we have to denote it in some way. And so where do we go? And I don't have an answer for the perfect phrase. Some of you may. Some of you may have practices in place and say, we don't use problem behavior. And that's pretty common now. Although people may refer to it colloquially as that, when you look inside of organizations, I think a lot of people are rightly moving away from like problem behavior or even the phrase maladaptive behavior. And the most gotcha point about that is it seems pretty adaptive to me. Who it's maladaptive for is probably one of the best expressions of ableism as you can get, in the sense that we see a behavior, we call it maladaptive because we think it's getting in the way of something we think is more important. And then you're going to say, yeah, but it is really important. I didn't say it wasn't. It might be, in fact, really important. And this may, in fact, get in the way of teaching the way you want to teach it to get there. But it's certainly adaptive for them because they're definitely communicating in a way that says, I'm not going to do this. Are you joking? I mean, there is a lot of amusement in human activity. And sometimes when I am confronted with a behavior that I would say is a concern, I use that as an opportunity to think about, well, who's it a concern for? And what does this say about me? Versus what does it say about them? And by shifting it into something about me, it helps me think more productively about how I want to move forward in service to them. When I think about all the things that it says about that person, I think you can quickly kind of come to the realization that, well, you don't know if any of that's true, really, unless you're working in a very sophisticated language kind of situation where there is a lot of perspective taking skill on both sides, where you can have that kind of earnest conversation. I think in the absence of that, which is for most of us, I think I have found it more beneficial to say, well, what does this concern say about me versus what this concern says about them? And then, I think a more contemporary phrase, behaviors of concern. You've heard me use these, or barrier behaviors. Again, there's no right answer to this. There might be wrong answers, but there's no right answer of like, what should I call it then? I think don't get distracted. If you find yourself in that part of the conversation, don't get distracted by that. It's not to say that isn't important. It's just to say, I think you're going to arrive at a phrase that communicates what you want to communicate better when you dive deeper into this concept inside of this conversation, than getting stuck on, well, what do I call it? Darn it. And I just want to move forward. I think if you find yourself there, that I would encourage or invite you to consider that there's an opportunity to look at something a little bit differently under those conditions. So anyway, what we say, it matters. Secret word number one, differential. Secret word number one, not so secret anymore, differential. Don't see anything in the Q&A thus far. So one thing that you may want to do as being a helpful colleague is maybe one of you want to write in there differential. And not differential in the kind of thing from your car necessarily, but differential in the sense of reinforcement. You know where I'm going with this, right? Look at that. Look at that. Good people. Good people looking out for their friends, for their colleagues. Thanks for being a help there. Appreciate that. All right, little look into our history. So these are course headings for a graduate level course. And then you can guess, okay, let's look at these. And then over to the right-hand side, you can guess what decade did this course get taught. And this is an opportunity just to kind of take a look, just kind of review, like, okay, well, what was getting taught? This is in an interventions class, not in an assessments class. This is in an interventions course. And you're looking at this and you're thinking, maybe this looks, I don't know, it'd be very curious. Does this look similar to a course you took? I think by now you can kind of tell this is a course I took because of the thing that I said. Yeah, you're going to get the recording. But look at that. I mean, you can kind of just see it's like playing the hits in behavior analysis. And maybe your eyes get drawn to things like, oh man, you spent a whole week on punishment. What does it mean to have special populations? What was feeding disorders like? And is non-removal of the spoon still the benchmark for what you do in a feeding intervention? And let me just say something, who has a spouse who has done research in feeding, and know colleagues who are way out in front and are the people to call when you have feeding issues. Feeding is a very interesting, and some of you might be nodding like, yep, that's a tough one. And listen, if that's a little outside of your scope of practice, which I'll be honest with you, for me, if I had a situation where I needed to be working in that context, I know exactly who I'm calling. I'm not making any assumptions under those conditions. That's a tough thing. Can be a tough thing, but hey, there's some real expertise out there. But maybe your eye is drawn to other things, but you can kind of see how this course is divided into things. And I don't see anybody willing to think of what decade this was thought of. Do we think, I mean, you're kind of looking at me and you're thinking, okay, when did this guy go to school? He's probably using that zoom effect that softens his appearance only a little, just a little bit, just a little touch up, not a big touch up. Yeah, Jennifer, good. That's exactly when that was. Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer, nail on the head. Jennifer, maybe you and I, maybe we know this. So well done, Jennifer. Thanks for participating in the game. Well, I'll be honest with you. Maybe some of the phrases or headings might look differently. This is a high level. I mean, this was for both doctoral and master's level students at the time. I mean, it was certainly part of a course sequence that that participated in what you needed to get the credential from the BACB at the point. But if we kind of look at this and we just pull out what are the themes inside of this, they all kind of fit within this. And this is kind of like what you're going to do now, or it's kind of like what you were going to do 40 years ago. I mean, you're going to look at teaching new behaviors. You're going to look at some kind of fading, right? You're probably going to use some sort of, stimulus fading, maybe some other fading strategy. There's not that many. You've got extinction, right? I don't like to use the metaphor of a tool. Like these are tools we're going to use. I like to think of this as, these are the things that we have access to because of the way that we've organized our discipline. Look, if you live within the world, like most of us do, inside of thinking about behavior within antecedents, consequences, motivational variables, and you kind of live in that ABC world, and you kind of put a little bit more around it, whether it be motivation, maybe you're getting a little bit more contemporary, kind of thinking about how context plays a role in that. You're kind of playing around with antecedents and consequences, and then you're going to kind of play around with all of these things. And when you think about the work that has been done, a lot of these things have been talked about for many decades. I mean, I don't know how many people have formal training or integrate into their practice imitation repertoires. I imagine if you're teaching young learners, you probably have some imitation skills, right? We understand it from a developmental perspective as critical. for not only social development, but also just adaptive development inside of things of like, oh, this is kind of what, oh, got it. This is kind of what we're doing. Understood. Is imitation a helpful repertoire to develop? Absolutely. Can you overtrain it? Probably. Can it cause problems? Absolutely. Why? Because you're a human being, regardless of whether or not you have a diagnosis or you're just me and you, and we've gone undiagnosed for things, but probably, probably need one. Do we have behaviors that pose concerns that make things more difficult to achieve the things we say are important? Absolutely. We're human beings. And statistically speaking, most of you work with people diagnosed with autism. You work with autistic kids, adults, adolescents, which one of the things that really sets autism apart from other quote unquote disabilities is the fact that it's really an expression of behavioral excesses and deficits. Sometimes you do things too much and sometimes you do it not enough. And who says it's not enough or too much? Well, usually the people that are assessing it. And are there problems with that? Yeah. Do we have to reconcile some of those things? Yeah. Do we need to evolve and refine? Absolutely. Does it mean those things go away? Probably not. Probably not entirely, but maybe they evolve and refine in a way where there can be some consensus, agreement, and contentment with the direction we're moving forward. And I think that as we get into maybe some cultural competency stuff today, we can look at maybe where we are and we can perhaps be generous to ourselves in the vulnerability that some of us are willing to have in pursuit of being in better service to those that we work with and for. But the point of this looking at is, what do we have here? Well, we kind of have the things that we have access to. Maybe we talk about them a little differently. Maybe we employ them not at all or much less, but maybe we're curious about like, oh, okay, well, what sort of coercive and punitive environments exist? I mean, we should be sensitive to those, especially if you're maybe in the assessment phase. This doesn't go anywhere. You have an option and you have an ethical obligation to remove it, certainly from your practice. But when you look at all of this, you're probably going to do some schedule work. You're going to do some antecedent and motivational adjustments. And most of these things are going to relate to those things, right? Because you live in an antecedent behavior consequence in some sort of environmental configuration. You're good radical behaviorists in that case. Doesn't mean that's the only way. It just means that's the way that pervades our applied practice. And that's a darn effective way to help treat individuals seeking service in that regard. But regardless of this, our past can make it a little tricky. So I sent up those course headings from an interventions course, but I didn't offer any of the readings that were done in that kind of thing. And when we look at our research that we lean on to help inform our academic pursuits, whether that be for an advanced degree, a credential, or when we look at it when we're faced with maybe a circumstance where we feel like maybe some things have gone on in the research base that we want to make sure that we're staying up in front of, so that we make sure that our practice reflects best practice and current trends. Trends not in the sense that I'm just going to jump ship and I'm just going to follow those trends, but I'm going to scrutinize them. I'm going to think about, how they reflect the refinement and evolution of our discipline. But there's a tricky relationship between what we discover and demonstrate inside of a research setting and what we have to do in practice. And listen, I mean, you don't have to go much further than Hank Pennypacker's 1981 article on terms about analysis and him lamenting the lack of analysis that's going on both in the research domain, but also in the applied domain. And we have for decades been dealing with this separation, so to speak, of research and practice. And, I don't need to pile on that argument necessarily, but it feels like if we keep arriving at that same distinction, then maybe we're not doing ourselves any service because nothing seems to be changing. So I'm a more optimistic observer of these things. And I think that it takes creative reading from non-academic and non-research-based individuals to see what value may be there inside of the research base. And I also think it takes a level of communication that at times is more sophisticated than we often observe in the applied domain in communication to both the theoretical and experimental domain. So I think in many ways we all can do better. And that's a nice place to be. It means that we're not done yet. And I think that provides not only comfort in the fact that you've chosen a discipline that is not dying, but rather looking to get better, looking to refine. But I think that it is incumbent on us in the applied setting to be as creative as is necessary to see what might be of value there, and not to dismiss it outright because it doesn't fit a mold that perhaps we're looking for. So maintaining that scientific curiosity and skepticism, frankly, that keeps us learning from others, even if it doesn't seem immediately appropriate or immediately applicable necessarily. And then we kind of ask these questions, that we asked in the past are windows into the context that we no longer practice in. So you look at an article, and many times there are words, terms, phrases, things that refer to things that are cringy. They just don't feel good, and you're like, I don't want to look at this stuff. It's written by a dirtbag. We've learned things about them, and listen, I think that dismissiveness is not inconsequential, and I'm not trying to be an apologist necessarily, but I think it's important to examine that and think about what do we throw away from a discipline that accumulates. That's what sciences do. They accumulate, they refine, and evolve over time. And yes, we need to be able to separate the cringeworthy things from the value that has in our literature base. And we can look at some of those things deep within the past of behavior analysis and not use them as justification for maintaining a practice, but perhaps looking at maybe part of the principled demonstration that they did in that case. So, I mean, there's a lot of work inside of extinction, for example, with non-human organisms that have a profound implication for the work that we do. And I wouldn't I wouldn't be too quick to dismiss some basic, either found in the experimental analysis of behavior from an operant paradigm or from a contextual behavior science paradigm, where maybe they're doing some implicit relational responding work, IRAP work, or other interesting work that they're doing there. Or maybe you're looking into the Pavlovian literature and you think to yourself, my goodness gracious, what is this guy talking about? Are you joking? No, I'm not joking at all. There are preparations that you can glean pretty insightful opportunities of arranging essentially antecedent and consequent schedules in a way that might be helpful in a practice setting that could be of value. So even though that they may not seem immediately applicable. And then again, that cringeworthy past research, they use words, phrases, terms that we no longer use, doesn't necessarily diminish the point that's being made. It does require us to read that with a new lens. And perhaps in some instances, it is indictment worthy on the individual who wrote it. And in other instances, perhaps we reserve the right to indict that individual, and we look for the value that remains without holding it too closely, let's say. I would also caution against the emphasis that some have in recency. I only look at, well, it doesn't matter, that research is way too old. In some instances, that is absolutely the case, especially when it's not coherent any longer. It no longer fits with the way we think about what we do. And so absolutely, there's a coherency element that's usually going to have to come from an individual with a pretty savvy conceptual background that is able to kind of identify, look, this is not in keeping with the foundations that we have in our discipline. So certainly there is a time to set aside old literature because it's no longer coherent with the way that our science is structured. But certainly in behavior analysis, that's not always the case. And so as much as it is important to rely on what's happening right now, and certainly keeping a finger on the pulse of contemporary work that is vetted and scrutinized and is really rigorously done, I am more of the balanced sort that thinks, okay, well, I'm not ready to throw everything else out and kind of hold multiple things at one time. And I'm also going to keep a keen eye on what's going on right now. And then we'll talk a little bit more in more detail about ableism, because that has had a pretty big impact on the way that I think about things, that has revealed some vulnerabilities in me that I've been very, very thankful for and grateful to a number of my close colleagues, but also just the conversation more generally about how that's going on, and share a little bit about what that looks like. these are kind of things that I've talked a little bit about up until this point, but holding more than one thought at a time. It's okay to set aside features of something while seeing the value in that thing. We are often greater than the constituent parts of ourselves, and that is true for every one of us among us. And so sometimes the source makes it unreadable, unorientable. You cannot orient to that anymore because of where it comes from. And that's a good indication that, okay, maybe I need to set that aside in whole cloth. It's too toxic to look at. And there are certainly things out there in the academic setting, and certainly in our past, that's just too toxic. I just don't need to go there. That is over, and I'm okay putting a very, very thick line, not in sand that gets blown away, but in concrete, although concrete can kind of crack and stuff. So maybe that's not a good metaphor. I'll think about another metaphor down the road. And that's good, but making that choice powerfully, and having that choice be principled so that you can articulate why that is the case is really helpful. And I think there's a lot of variability in that level of sophistication in speaking with in colleagues. Some are absolutely there; they're way out in front, and I like listening to them a lot because they make those choices principally, and they communicate that in a way that you can react to, in a way that is reveals their scholarship. Very, very grateful for them. And there are many others that don't. It's more just kind of a personal thing versus really allowing it to have developed into the kind of rigorous work necessary for it to kind of move into their professional sense. And then this kind of issue, the perspective taking problem as it pervades in ableism. We'll get to that in the next slide, so we'll pause on that for a moment. And this notion of a great deal of choice, I think, is important to reveal and at least acknowledge, not that it needs revealing because we all know that intuitively, but this idea of we have a lot of choice in the way we organize our systems within our organization. And although those choices are informed by our discipline, our science, they are also informed by what we value. And I encourage all of us to do the work necessary to really clarify those professional values, to make sure that we've got not just those declared, but that we have measures in place. And measurement doesn't look like necessary, I'm not taking tallies necessarily, so although you can. But seeing how closely aligned our actions are to the things we say we care about. So if we say we care about bringing assent-based practice into our organization, okay, that's great. That's a value worth having. But what does that look like? What action is being taken, and what action over time has it demonstrated? Word number 2, not really a word necessarily. Anti. I mean, anti is a word. It does have its own individual meaning, but often added to another word to adjust its meaning. But anti. Okay, so throw that in there. Not a lot of questions today. Not a lot of yeah buts, which can be good. Quick through ableism, and I just want to give a nod to some colleagues of mine, because a lot of this is, I am a student of this. I'm an observer of this. I'm not way out in front of this. This is not my area of expertise. And my colleagues, Kristen Smith and Caspro and Carrie Millico and many others have done a lot to draw my attention to both historical things that really legitimizes it for me in terms of the depth of scholarship that has gone on in this space, but it has really encouraged and invited me to think about this not in kind of a checkbox way, like, yep, I don't do that, but really have me think about the way that this pervades not only our discipline, but really, much of all medically adjacent professions. This pervades speech pathology, occupational therapy. And when I say pervades, I'm not saying this to you personally. You might be one of the ones way out in front of this. You may have done the work to reconcile your professional activities with some of these themes. So I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about us collectively and those of us that we are adjacent to. whether that be in other psychological domains, whether that be in other medically adjacent domains, whether that be in medicine more specifically. These kinds of ways of thinking are very deeply rooted in those disciplines. And it's not to say you can just throw them away, right? Disability is inherently bad. Maybe you personally don't think that way, but there might be aspects or themes embedded in this cycle that you could say, yeah, I mean, how do I separate that? Maybe I use different words, but disability must be cured or overcome. People with disabilities, can be spoken and acted for, okay? And only non-disabled people can diagnose and make these decisions for disabled people. And maybe you, at first glance, say, I don't believe that. That's not the way that I think. That's a fabulous first reaction, but I would encourage and invite more time spent inside of these spaces to think, okay, what if I changed the words a little bit? What if I made some slight adjustments where maybe I could find myself in some of this? And I think that when we are honest with each other as a collective, we're going to find a lot of our past right inside of these things. And it doesn't mean it's easy to just throw it away, but it is something to confront and to scrutinize and to rigorously work out of. And it has profound implications for what a practice would look like. It would completely be a transformative way of looking at ABA. It would change the way we would ask questions in a research context. It would have implications for almost every aspect of what we do, the kinds of assessments we use, the type of interventions we implement, the type of measures we take. I'm not saying it changes our science because, look, we're not getting outside of that A, B, C motivation context kind of bubble. That doesn't change. But everything inside of it has to do with what it might look like here. It might change the way you think about extinction. It doesn't mean extinction is no longer a principled observation that has mountains and mountains of data. You can think about it under those conditions. It just changes the way it might look from an application standpoint. So ask yourself this question, if you want to, are you interested in assent-based interventions? Do you have assent-based interventions at the ready? Well, look, if you're an essentials user, you do, right? You pop right into essential. You can do this. This is written by one of the foremost experts, Kristen Smith, inside of Essentials. She's published articles in this space, workshops. I mean, this is a go-to person. And you say, I really want to explore what this looks like. Go explore it. Explore it in different teaching arrangements you like, discrete trial, naturalistic instruction. You want to embed this? Look, there is a 11-step program you can put in your learner right now if you want to get this going. And maybe what you do from the standpoint of, well, how do we get this started, is you get this started by selecting one person who really wants to champion this in the organization. I want to see how this fits with our learners. So we're going to start small as a pilot program, and we're going to see how we can build this out and make it appropriate for everybody. And again, for those essentials users, you can edit those programs, you can individualize them as necessary. There's a lot of opportunity at the ready with some pretty sophisticated content to get this in your learners' programming right now. And look, maybe it's not Assent, but here, let's go back. Maybe you'll see other things that you like. Persistence. What would this look like if you had a lot of these types of things in there? Oh, I've got an individual who does not want to work in this kind of thing. Well, all right, there's a lot of work that can be done to support the work that wants to be done later. I think from the standpoint of assent-based information, one rebuttal that I have, which I think is a little bit shallow, not to be too discounting of it, but to discount it a little bit of, yeah, so what am I supposed to do? Just let them do what they want? Okay, well, what am I going to do? When you take this notion of that it can be communicated vocally or verbally, non-verbally, vocally, non-vocally in that case, but it's still verbal behavior, but you can withdraw from any time. So, okay, so we're just not going to get this done. That's just not going to make any progress. Oh my goodness gracious. My first reaction to these types of sentiments is, this is the most unique and this is the thing that behavior analysts do better than almost anybody else. Under those conditions, we observe behavior. It's curious. I've established these kinds of conditions. I know they have access to something that they have demonstrated they want if they just do this thing. If They engage in this if-then relationship. I know that I've done my due diligence to establish conditions for them to achieve something that they say that they want, that I've watched them use, engage with, and enjoy down the road. And nonetheless, they just don't want to do it. So what are we going to do? Not do it? Oh my goodness gracious. This is the most behavior analytic opportunity I have ever seen. There is so much to explore under those things, in the sense that you have identified that you've established conditions that appear perfect for performance. And yet it doesn't happen. And yet you get these barrier type behaviors that demonstrate assent withdrawal, meaning they do not. It's an agreement to participate, and now they disagree to participate. I don't want to do this. And if you work with kids of any age, of any diagnosis or non-diagnosis, typically developing, atypically developing, you say, what does that mean? I'd say, look, we might need to find new terms. I don't know. But it does not follow normal trajectory. What is normal? I don't know. We're learning a lot about that right now. We're learning that the normal band is not so thin, but it's pretty broad. And there's a lot of developmental psychology that can help assist us in understanding a little bit about that. But I think that the point here is, okay, this is kind of a contemporary thing that's going on in our discipline. And what do we have in access to this? Well, I've shown you one concrete example and a few other adjacent ones that are exactly what you can put in place to this. But this is a thing to explore, and not explore from like a provocative kind of, I'm at a conference and I'm just going to kind of pick apart this issue, but really the people that are doing the difficult work, that are making this happen, what do you want your practice to look like? When hard things are hard, it makes it very difficult when that's just hard all the time. We don't like to live like that. We don't like to participate under those conditions. What would it look like if you made the commitment to your learners that you're not going to make things easy, but that they're prepared to do hard things, and they see you as an advocate toward doing hard things? Hard things don't go away. Whether you're an autistic or you're a neurotypical individual, hard things are still going to be hard. But wouldn't it be nice if you had someone you could count on to be right next to you when things get hard? And I think that what we're learning from a lot of autistic advocates out there is that sometimes they felt like they didn't have that person. They didn't have that comfort, that they felt that the person with them is with them. They felt like they were against them in a lot of ways. That's a real hard way to get a lot of progress in. And I think all of us in that practice space, when we really let that sink in, tells us we have a lot of opportunity to be with them so that we can do hard things together. Hard things don't go away. And it's not about transitioning your practice so that everything's easy, right? It's about establishing conditions where you can do hard things. You can feel safe doing them. And you can feel like if you fail, it doesn't mean anything bad about you. That just sounds like good human experience. It also means that it changes the way behavior analysts think about the things that need to be taught. There are some things that when you know them, they really unlock a lot of opportunity for you. And I think some of the best behavior analysts that I know out there really think about it in those terms. They know that there are foundational things that if you know them, if you can do them proficiently, fluently even, it's really going to make things elsewhere a lot more easy for you. You can be more independent in that space. And that's generally a good thing. And furthermore, independence means that you have choice. You get to choose. You get to start to develop refined preferences that guide you in certain directions. Some behavior analysts need to lighten up a little bit, not be so rigid about what needs to be taught when and to what extent. We've got some learning to do, all of us, myself included. And so I think that this conversation more generally is one that provides a lot of opportunity for self-reflection, for perspective taking, for vulnerability and care for others. Other things that we can do is diversity and cultural competence. And I'll be very honest with you. This is me. I'm a middle-aged white dude. Think I'm the person to talk about diversity and cultural competency? As I said at the onset, this is not my area of expertise. We do have experts in behavior analysis in this. And I listen to them. I'm a student of this, an observer of this. I have a lot more to learn. I have a lot more to talk about. And this, in some instances, is an opportunity to kind of, to not play in a pejorative sense, but play in the sense of we play with our ideas. And by play, you discover and you learn and you explore. And there's a lot to explore here. Frankly, wish I would have done this 20 years ago when I started working with parents, which, I think I probably would have had a lot more early success had I been a little bit more sensitive to these things instead of being more prescriptive. Stealing a slide, which was not created by Cass, soon to be Dr. Bro, but adapted from something that has been around for quite some time, late 80s. In a recent workshop that Cass and I did at the California Association for Behavior Analysis, um, Cass remarked that they believed that we were somewhere kind of in this pre-competence, and some people are in that competence stage. And, again, some of the experts in our discipline might be way out there in that proficiency side of things. But thinking about the continuum of cultural competency, exploring cultural issues and not having this differences are ignored. There was a period, and a very substantial one, not because they were trying to be necessarily discounting of differences, but when early on in behavior analytic practice, when all behavior was just thought of as behavior and you didn't think about the layered implications of that behavior, well, that led to pretty efficient sort of strategies to changing that behavior, which early on, that's what they were invested in. But we've done that. We don't need to do that anymore. That work is done, demonstrated, and pretty solid. But it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means they were up to something different. Well, we're up to something different now. And we have a broader sense of competency that allows us to encourage the consideration of a lot more things. And that cultural competency is going to be a big one. I think that by adhering to a commitment around being more culturally competent, it doesn't mean complicit. It doesn't mean I'm not going to be curious or skeptical of things, but it means I am going to be curious about how I can develop and refine my own perspective in a way that's inclusive for others so that I can do the good work that I was asked to do. Last but not least, last word, ethics. Differential, anti, and ethics. Those are your three secret words. And as promised, didn't reteach the intervention scores or the assessment scores. There's no way to do that. But there is a way to have a conversation amongst us as professionals. And wherever we find ourselves in this continuum, consider that this is exactly where you should be. Some of us are way out in front, so out in front that they're waiting for a lot of us to catch up. And sometimes they can be a little bit aggressive with the time it's taking. And that's great. Listen to those voices, hear those voices, and feel encouraged and inspired to move faster if necessary. But there's a lot of other voices here too, and I encourage you to listen to them all. Whether it's someone like myself who's exploring some of these issues on their own professional sense, anti was the second word. Differential, anti, and ethics. Wherever you find yourself, just acknowledge and be gracious to yourself that where you are in that conversation is a fine place to be. Be open, be curious, be thoughtful, caring, compassionate towards others, considerate towards others. And I think we're all going to move this ship. It's not going to move as fast as some people want. It's probably not going to move as fast as we need. But we're all on the ship together. If you like the ship metaphor, maybe you like a train or a car, or maybe you just like a big space rock like Earth. We're all on that together too. And I'm not saying we're here to change everything, but I do think we can get better in the practice that we have to those that we serve. And I thank you all very much for your time and attention. Like I said, you're going to get an end of the webinar survey. Please take that survey. It's really valuable information. And that information is used. It's used to inform what comes next, what you like, what you don't. One of the things that I really love about Central Reach, one among many, is that they listen very, very carefully to the people that are our customers. And it doesn't always happen as fast as people want it to because everybody wants things to happen really quickly. But I will tell you on the back end, this data is used and it's used to inform what to do next and how best to give you what you guys want. Ultimately, we're committed to you and the work that you do. And we're here to try and make that as efficient, effective as possible. And so we want to make sure that you have access to the things that are going to make a difference for you in your practice. I want to thank you all very, very much for the work that you do. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for continuing to create conditions for me to learn as a behavior analyst, as a human being. It means a lot to me to be affiliated with this group of behavior analysts. These are my people. These are my colleagues. I care very deeply about our discipline, and I care very much, and I'm thankful very much for all of those of you that care equally to that. And yes, have a wonderful rest of your week and day. And I look forward to the next time I get to be with you. Thank you very much.